before the first temple rose from marble and sunlight, before choral hymns drifted through olive groves, before the names of heroes were etched into memory, there were stories murmured by firelight. Greek mythology, our subject tonight, wasn't a mere pastime or a fanciful decoration for festivals. It was the operating system of a civilization. It explained why the sun traveled, why the sea grew violent, why fate could be kind one morning and merciless by dusk. It gave shape to the winds and the seasons, clothed abstractions like justice, love, and vengeance in human forms, and made the world feel inhabited by intention. To the ancient Greeks, myth didn't sit apart from reality. It seeped into law, ritual, family life, agriculture, and war. It was religion and science, theater and therapy, instruction and danger woven into one living fabric. Our path this evening will follow a chronological logic, the mythic timeline, as the Greeks themselves often felt it in the sources that survive. Give the birth of the cosmos from a formless gap, the rule of sky and earth, the reign of the Titans, the thunder-wrought rise of Zeus and his siblings, the securing of cosmic order against monsters and giants, the making and unmaking of humankind, the bright, brief heroic age when demigods and mortals stood shoulder to shoulder, and finally, the fading of that age into the shadows of remembered glory, out of which real history and philosophy begin to glow. This is not history, as modern historians write it, but it is a chronology of meaning, how the Greeks imagined their own origins and moral landscape. You'll hear names tonight that echo through Western literature. From Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, we draw the genealogies of gods and the moral sketch of the 5 ages of man. From Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, we inherit the blazing core of the Trojan cycle and its aftermath. From Apollodorus's Bibliotheca, we gain a careful, almost librarian's ordering of myths. The tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, refine these tales, adding psychology and ritual force. Later, Roman voices like Ovid refract Greek stories through their own sensibilities, yet preserve narratives otherwise lost. Myth is a chorus. It has many soloists, and sometimes they disagree. Where one poet says, "The sea god did this," another puts the deed in a goddess's hands. That is not a flaw, but a feature. Myth lives by retelling. As we walk through this mythic timeline, keep in mind how the Greeks heard it, not as bedtime fluff, but as ethical instruction wrapped in wonder. When gods punish arrogance, the audience is meant to feel the risk of overreaching. When Prometheus steals fire, listeners taste both compassion and defiance. When heroes rise and fall, the lesson is not that courage shields you from tragedy, but that greatness and grief often share a doorway. The Greeks were clear-eyed about luck, limits, and the price of glory. For pacing, imagine the steady rhythm of oars on black water, the lantern of the moon catching the edge of waves. We begin, in quiet. Before cities, before altars, before the first lyre was strung, there was a silence, like a held breath. Out of that breath comes chaos, not noise, not confusion, but a gap, a yawning, open, and from that open, the first presences step forth. Earth, night, the underworld's depth, the binding force of desire itself. These are not characters with witty dialogue, they are realities with names. As they act and interweave, the world thickens. Sky arches above earth, and with her, sires the next generation. Titans, vast as elements, one-eyed smiths who craft thunder, and beings with 100 hands who personify ungoverned force. From a family quarrel more immense than mountains, time itself begins to feel cyclical. Fathers overthrown by sons, order hammered from tumult, and then threatened again from within. Our chronology tonight honors that cycle. First, the primordials, the moment the stage itself appears. Next, the Titans, nature's colossal first government. Then, the Olympians burst into their reign with lightning, followed quickly by the great wars that stabilized the cosmos, the Titanomachy, the Gigantomachy, and the dragon storm of Typhon. With the sky settled and the seas bounded, attention moves to humanity, our making, our mistakes, our punishments, and our stubborn hope. At last, the heroic age flares into view. Perseus, Theseus, Heracles, Bellerophon, and the long, hard gleam of the Trojan War, like the twilight, in which gods still walk on battlefields, but less frequently, and men start to pay history's full price. Listen for the Greek sense of measure, sophrosine, restraint. Again and again, myth says, know your limits, honor what stands above you, accept that gifts come with edges. Also listen for the Greek passion for craft and cunning, how Metis, wise counsel, rescues infants, how Odysseus bends disaster with language, how smiths and seers shape fate by understanding materials, both visible and invisible. The cosmos is ordered, but not simple. Divine justice exists, but it is not always immediate, and hope small, stubborn, luminous remains in the jar, even when suffering has flown out over the world. Light your inner lamp, settle your breathing. We will move carefully, step by step, through the entire sweep of Greek mythology, as the Greeks themselves might have heard it, not as dead antiquity, but as living counsel. Our journey begins with a world that is not yet a world, a gap waiting to be filled, a hush waiting to be sung into being. Out of that hush, the first names arrive, and with names, story, with story, order, with order, the human heart finds both warning and comfort. Let us begin, primordial beings. At first, there is chaos, a word that, in this oldest context, does not imply a shouting match of elements, but a chasm, a yawning openness. Think of a door cracked to the night, a blackness, not malevolent, simply unfilled. From this openness, presences emerge that are less like characters than conditions of existence. Gaia, Earth, arrives, steady, bodyful, the ground itself, the promise that something can stand. Tartarus, the deep pit, yawns downward, a spatial limit that is also a spiritual one, the place where what cannot be allowed to roam must be held. Eros arises, too, not the flirtatious deity of later statues, but the binding force of desire, the impulse that draws the unlike into union so that something new can be born. Alongside these come Erebus, shadow, and Nyx, night, the velvet around things, the reminder that not all is visible. That mystery will always have its rooms. From Gaia herself come structures of the world, the mountains rearing like ribs, the long-breathing body of Pontus, the sea. Then Gaia, without partner, brings forth Uranus, the sky star-scattered, vast, and, in mythic logic, masculine, not because he is domineering, but because he covers, stretches over Earth, enclosing and fertilizing. Gaia and Uranus unite. With their union, fertility pours into the world. Their children are the Titans, enormous and conceptually grand. Oceanus, the freshwater river girdling the earth. Hyperion, Capuslic, linked with sunlit splendor. Themis, divine law and right order. Mnemosyne, memory, mother of the muses, who will someday give music and speech to human truth. Coeus, Crius, Iapetus, Tethys, Thea, Phoebe, and the youngest. Cronus, sharp of mind and edged like a new blade. But Uranus, though beautiful and immense, is afraid. His fear focuses on the other children, the rougher offspring of Gaia and himself, the Cyclopes, each with a single blazing eye and hands made for forging the unimaginable. And the Hecatoncheires, beings with 100 hands and 50 faces, whose very existence spells ungoverned strength. Fearing to be surpassed, Uranus presses them back into Gaia, stuffing his own children into the Earth's depths. The image is brutal, children forced back into the mother's body, the mother groaning beneath the burden of her imprisoned young. With that pain comes resolve. Gaia, as Earth and as mother, will not endure tyranny from her own mate. She fashions a sickle of adamant, hard beyond metal, and calls upon her Titan sons to act. Most hesitate. Uranus is the sky itself. But Cronus, clever and ambitious, steps forward. He hides, watching his father descend again to embrace Gaia. Then, at the appointed moment, he swings the sickle. Castration, a terrible unseating. Uranus recoils. The severed part falls into the sea. From the blood that sprinkles Gaia's surface rise the Erinyes, fury, who avenge blood-kin murdered by their own. From that same life spill, the giants and Meliae, ash tree nymphs, are born. And far out in the foam, where the sea carries the severed flesh, something astonishing gathers. Aphrodite, the great irresistible, steps, a sure desire now given face and footfall. This is the first regime change in Greek myth, and it sets the pattern. A father, fearing his children, attempts to suppress them. The mother, allied with a son, engineers overthrow. The cosmos advances by intergenerational conflict, not gentle succession. If this feels grim, remember, the Greeks saw power, even divine power, as something that demands restraint. The story acknowledges terror inside the beautiful Uranus's sky, masking a tyrant's heart, and beauty inside the terrible Aphrodite. Born from violence, a paradox that Greeks never stopped contemplating. With Uranus unseated, Cronus becomes ruler, and the Titanic order begins. For a time, the world breathes easier. Gaia's burden is lifted. The Cyclopes and Hundred-Handers, however, remain shut away. Cronus has learned only half the lesson. The cosmos has gained a new king, but not yet achieved a just order. The seeds of the next upheaval are already planted. For prophecy, never far from Greek storytelling, whispers that a child of Cronus will overthrow him, just as he overthrew his own father. Pause over the primordials once more. They are not puzzle pieces in a tidy mythic jigsaw. They are principles. Chaos is the possibility of becoming. Gaia is substance and fertility, the bearer and the born. Tartarus is the moral architecture that says there must be a down, where unchecked force is confined. Eros is the engine by which separation becomes union, and then becomes offspring. Cosmos, as kinship, night and shadow, insist that obscurity is not the enemy of truth. Rather, truth ripens in darkness and reveals itself in time. From these, the familiar gods will eventually rise, with voices and quarrels. But their stage, this world has already been built by beings who are more like laws than like neighbors. The Greeks could have told a story where a single benevolent creator speaks, and everything comes forth obediently. Instead, they tell a family drama. Real creation is costly. It hurts. It demands courage. It leaves scars. The world we inhabit, they say, is not a toy, but a serious place, whose foundations were laid with pain, ingenuity, and the steadying work of desire. With that foundation set, the lights change. The Titans take their thrones. For a golden moment, there is abundance. But in the palace of the new king, fear is eyes open, and a mother will soon hide a child. The cycle turns. The Titans, and the first cosmic order. Cronus ascends, the adamant sickle still cold with the memory of rebellion. Beside him stands Rhea, his sister bride, a figure of majesty and motherhood. The world settles into what the poets later call a golden age, not because all creatures sing in perfect accord, but because the essential needs of life seem effortlessly met. Fields bear grain without plow, orchards ripen without pruning, and humankind, still early, still innocent, in the Greek imagination, lives long and dies softly, as if lulled into sleep. No ships yet scar the sea. No iron yet bites the earth. Justice does not need courts. Community rests upon a shared, untroubled plenty. Yet within the king, there is the familiar worm of fear. Cronus knows the script he wrote Act I. A parent who seizes power by overthrow will likely be overthrown by a child. Whether the warning comes from Gaia, from prophetic night, or from the simple logic of guilt, it takes root. When Rhea gives birth to their first child, Hestia, Cronus acts not as a father, but as a jailer. He swallows the newborn whole. Rhea pleads, but fear is louder. Demeter follows Hestia into his belly, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. The image is grotesque, infants lodged, still living, in their father's gut. In some traditions, the swallowed children grow there, aware, waiting. The Golden Age now has a dark kitchen. Rhea's grief ripens into strategy. When her labor begins again, she escapes to Crete, to a cave on Mount Dicta, or Ida, in some tellings. There she bears Zeus, the sixth child, the thunderbolt waiting in swaddling. She swaddles a stone instead, passes the counterfeit to Cronus, and the terrified king gulps it down without a glance. Meanwhile, the baby is hidden away, nursed by the goat, Amalthea, and guarded by the Curetes, young warriors, who clash their shields and stamp their feet, so that the infant's cries vanish into rhythm. All tyrannies fear noise, but also, ironically, noise can protect what is tender until it is strong. Zeus grows in secrecy. The island shapes him. Sea smell, pine resin, cave shade, goat's milk. He learns from Metis wisdom, as forethought, how cunning can outmaneuver brute suspicion. Together, they design a potion that will make Cronus release what he hoards. At the appointed time, Zeus returns, disguised, and serves his father the draught. Cronus retches. Up come the swallowed children, not as infants but in the fullness of their divine youth. Hestia, serene hearth. Demeter, fertile furrow. Hera, sovereignty and marriage. Hades, lord of hidden wealth and the dead. Poseidon, sea lord and earth shaker. The family gathers around their youngest, and a war begins that will shape the sky itself. Before the clash pours over the titanic court, Cronus is not alone. Around him sit siblings vast as concepts. Oceanus, encircling all with fresh water. Tethys, who mothers the rivers and springs. Hyperion and Thea, the splendor, behind sun and sight. Coeus and Phoebe, intelligence and shining thought. Themis, right order. Mnemosyne, memory's deep well. Crius and Iapetus, whose sons will be Prometheus. And Atlas, names you already feel tightening like bowstrings. The Titans are not caricatures of cruelty. Many are dignified, even necessary. The tragedy of Cronus is that his private terror infects a household that could have governed well. Greek myth often says this quietly. One person's fear can distort an entire age. The Titanomachy is not a quick rebellion, but a 10-year stalemate. The Titans command height and habit. They know the strongholds, the weather of war, the old paths through the mountains. The young gods are fierce but green. For a decade, the earth shudders, seas heap themselves against land, and the sky flashes, not with celebration, but with conflict's signal fires. The poets do not give us a blow-by-blow. This is not a battlefield chronicle, but a cosmic arm wrestle, a stress test of a reality still new. It is Gaia who advises the decisive move. She whispers to Zeus what his father refused to hear: free the imprisoned. In Tartarus languish the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, pushed down there by Uranus's fear, and left there by Cronus's imitation of that fear. Zeus descends, the gates groan, chains fall away, gratitude becomes alliance. The Cyclopes, master smiths of forces as raw as thunderheads, forge 3 gifts whose poetry has outlived millennia. For Zeus, the thunderbolt. For Poseidon, the trident. For Hades, the helm of invisibility. The 100-handers bring not craft but sheer volume of force, boulders hurled in storms of stone, a new grammar of battle. Armed thus, the Olympians surge. The 100-handers' volleys break the Titan's lines. The thunderbolt becomes a verb the world will never forget. Seas rear at Poseidon's command, and, unseen beneath the clash, Hades moves masked, turning the tide where eyes cannot follow. One by one, the Titans fall or yield. Some Oceanus, often counted neutral, are spared, out of respect. Others are cast into Tartarus, fenced by bronze, guarded forever by their 100-handed jailers. Atlas, as son of Iapetus and ally of the old order, is punished with a task as symbolic as it is heavy: to bear the sky upon his shoulders at the world's edge, an image the Greeks loved because it honors strength even in defeat. With victory comes apportionment. The brothers draw lots. Zeus receives the sky, Poseidon the sea, Hades the underworld. Earth remains a common realm, to be tended and contested by all. The sisters take up their dignities. Hera near the throne with sovereignty's nod, Demeter with green in her hands, Hestia tending the central flame of home and city. The world has a government now, not just a throne, but rule is never once and done in these stories. There will be aftershocks, challenges from below and beyond, as if reality itself is testing the new arrangement. For now, though, the air clears. Lightning is no longer merely a weapon. It becomes also a sign, a sacramental flash, reminding mortals that justice and power dwell above. In the Titan chapter, Greek myth tells a simple but sobering truth. A ruler who swallows tomorrow to protect today destroys both. Cronus's fear of succession devoured the possibility of a stable future, and only by releasing what was trapped children, allies, latent strength, could the world move forward. It is a lesson that will echo in smaller keys when we turn to human kings and households. For the moment, remember the sound of chains falling in Tartarus and the glow of new forged thunder. The Olympians sit in their places. The cosmos is shaped, not finished. The next test is already approaching, carried on the feet of giant suns, and in the burning breath of something that is almost a mountain, is provisional. Zeus has won, if victory means thrones set, enemies bound, and banners raised on the windy heights of Olympus. But victory in Greek myth must be proven again, not because the gods are forgetful, but because the world contains more than one kind of threat. The Titans were about lineage and succession, a family battle played at the scale of continents. What comes next tests the very architecture of the cosmos. Boundaries, proportions, the balance between law and raw force. First arrives the rebound of Gaia's grief. The earth remembers her Titan sons clanking in Tartarus. A mother's sorrow becomes creative rage. From her, or from the blood of Uranus, or from a later union with Tartarus, myths vary. Come the giants, not merely tall men, but beings whose legs coil into serpents, whose hands lift boulders as if they were pebbles. Their names, Alcyoneus, Porphyrion, Enceladus, sound like the grinding of stone. Prophecy, that steady drum in Greek stories, declares that the gods cannot win without a mortal fighting beside them. This is new, a rule written into the world that limits even the divine, not to humiliate the gods, but to knit their fate with ours. So Zeus looks toward the mortal horizon and finds Heracles, a son of Zeus by a human woman, trained by hardship and clarified by labor. The gigantomachy is a mosaic of duels and ambushes. Athena hurls Enceladus down and pins him beneath Sicily, an explanation the Greeks liked for eruptions and earthquakes. Dionysus fights with the ivy-crowned fury of ecstasy, turned to battle rhythm. Apollo and Artemis shoot true, light and moon working in braided arcs, where the gods struggle to kill. Heracles' arrows make endings stick. Mortality's iron does what immortal blows cannot. It is not that man is stronger than God, it is that the world, in its design, requires partnership. The victory secures Olympus more deeply than the Titanomachy did, because it weaves divine order with human courage. No sooner is that done than a darker storm walks over the edge of the map. From the hot caverns where earth and abyss meet rises, Typhon, a being so huge the poets drop similes and resort to lists. 100 serpent heads, tongues that lap fire, voices that mimic beasts and gods, wings that churn tempests, hands that span valleys. Typhon is not just big, he is excess, the refusal of limit. Where the giants tested the gods against the rule of shared effort, Typhon tests whether measure the Greeks' sacred value can hold in the face of absolute magnitude. The battle is not pretty. The Homeric hymn to Apollo and Pindar hint. Apollodorus details. Typhon drives Zeus back, cuts the tendons from the king's hands and feet, hides them in a bearskin. Hermes and Aegipan, a goat god, steal them back cunning and pastoral quickness, rescuing sovereignty from annihilation. The fight burns across landscapes, Mount Casius in Syria, the valleys near Nysa, the Sicilian reaches where the air tastes of ash. At last, Zeus gathers the full grammar of storm, thunder, lightning, whirlwinds, and hurls Typhon down, crushing him under Mount Etna. When Etna burns, the Greeks hear the monster's breath. When the ground shakes, they feel his rage. But he is under, and that word means more than physical placement. He is subordinated to an order that now includes volcanoes and tempests as contained phenomena. With giants and Typhon quelled, Zeus's kingship matures from victory to jurisdiction. He apportions honors among the gods so that no sphere lies ownerless. Poseidon takes not only the open sea, but the quaking of the earth and the tempers of horses. Hades rules the underworld as a realm of law, where the dead are sorted and housed, not erased. Hera's dignity becomes the backbone of alliances and oaths among cities. Athena, born later in one of myth's great scenes, Zeus swallowing Metis. Then suffering a head-splitting birth of wisdom, armored presides over craft, strategy, and the city itself. Apollo orders measure in music and light. Artemis keeps the edges wild and births safe. Ares is the hot blood of war, often restrained by Athena's cooler hand. Aphrodite sweetens and complicates all bonds. Hephaestus forges. Hermes conducts and negotiates. Demeter makes the ground feed us. Hestia keeps hearth and polity centered. This is not a chaotic pantheon. It is a matrix of competencies, a divine bureaucracy whose politics mirror and shape the human. Order, however, is not tyranny, not anymore. Zeus learns from the failures of Skyfathers past. He does not swallow his offspring to prevent succession. Instead, he crafts a regime of relationships, checks, and balances in mythic form. Quarrels happen. This is a family, but they are held inside a frame. Even punishments now signal purpose. When Apollo and Poseidon are made to serve Laomedon of Troy for slighting Zeus, or when Ares is bound, or when Hera is suspended in golden chains, the myth conveys both danger and design. The gods answer to law, even if the enforcement is personal and theatrical. Beneath the divine court, the world of mortals begins to complicate. Cities rise, sailors learn the taste of far water, kings build walls that later songs will measure with grief. The gods, now secure, interact, they bless and block, woo and warn. Sacrifice takes its formal shape. Omen and oracle open channels for counsel. The Olympian order is not distant. It is porous. If the Titans were nature's bones and the primordials its laws, the Olympians are the institutions flexible, fallible, but enduring. One scene crystallizes Zeus's maturing kingship. The swallowing of Metis. Warned that Meti will bear a child who could overthrow him, Zeus does not cast her out. He incorporates her literally. Wisdom goes inside, sovereignty, not to be digested and erased, but to gestate a new kind of birth. From Zeus's head springs Athena, fully armed and crying, a shout of clarity that startles gods and men alike. Violence here is sublimated. The head-splitting comes by Hephaestus's tool, a craftsman's cut, and what emerges is not a rival, but a partner in rule, whose sphere is reasoned strength. It is myth's way of saying, a king who internalizes counsel births a polity that can last. From this high point, the chronology turns toward us. With the heavens stabilized, the story looks down to earth, to our clay, our hunger, our mistakes, and our stubbornness. The next chapter will speak of Prometheus, of a jar or box opened by a woman whose name means all gifted, of 5 ages through which humanity walks from effortless plenty to iron labor, carrying one ember that refuses to go out, hope. But remember what we have learned by watching the gods come into their own. Order is costly, power without measure is self-defeating, and even the divine needs partnership, first with giants and cyclopes, and then, astonishingly, with us, the Gigantomachy, and the world secured. The war against the Titans had ended, yet Greek myth reminds us that peace is never permanent. Even when order is established, new forces rise to test it, and the cycle of struggle continues. Having defeated Cronus and his siblings, the Olympian gods stood at the summit of their power. Zeus sat upon his throne, lightning flashing in his hand. The cosmos portioned among his brothers. It seemed that the age of the Olympians was secure. But deep within the earth, the poet Hesiod tells us that Gaia never forgave Zeus for hurling the Titans, her children, into the dark abyss of Tartarus. The weight of her grief transformed into rage, and from her womb, she brought forth another generation, the giants. They were vast beings, their lower bodies twisting into serpentine coils, their strength matched only by their fury. Their names carried the echo of thunder: Alcyoneus, Porphyrion, Enceladus, Ephialtes. They rose from the soil like towers, shaking the ground with every step. The Greeks believed that battles between gods and giants were etched into the very land. Volcanic plains, islands fractured by earthquakes, and mountains scarred by fire were, in their imagination, the battlegrounds of the Gigantomachy. The war between the Olympians and the giants. Zeus and his siblings prepared for war, but a prophecy whispered a warning. The giants could not be defeated by the gods alone. Victory required the hand of a mortal. That mortal was Heracles, son of Zeus, and a mortal woman, Alcmena. In this way, the cosmos itself was designed to be incomplete without the aid of humanity. Even the immortals needed the strength of one born to die. When the battle began, Olympus shook. The giants hurled mountains as though they were stones. They uprooted trees and used them as clubs. The sky filled with the clang of bronze, the hiss of serpents, the cries of gods locked in combat. Athena lifted her spear against Enceladus and struck him down, pinning his vast body beneath the island of Sicily, where he still stirs, his breath rising as volcanic fire. Poseidon shattered Polybotes with a fragment of the island of Kos. Apollo's arrows found their mark again and again, his golden bow singing through the chaos. But it was Heracles who tipped the scales. With his mortal bow, he shot arrow after arrow, each one carrying the mortal touch that prophecy demanded. When Porphyrion, the leader of the giants, charged toward Hera in lust and fury, Zeus struck him with a thunderbolt, and Heracles' arrow pierced his heart. The earth groaned, the mountains fell silent, and the giants were no more. Yet Gaia was not finished. In her deepest anguish, she consorted with Tartarus, the abyss itself, and bore a creature unlike any before. Typhon. Typhon was terror-made flesh. He was taller than mountains, his arms stretching across the horizon. Instead of fingers, he bore dragon heads, hissing and snapping. His body bristled with snakes, and his voice was a cacophony, sometimes human, sometimes bestial, sometimes roaring like a lion, sometimes shrieking like a storm. From his mouth poured fire, and his wings darkened the Sunday. He was the final and greatest test of Zeus's rule. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was the climax of divine struggle. When they clashed, the heavens and earth trembled. Zeus hurled thunderbolts that split the air. Typhon responded with gales and flame. At one point, Zeus was overwhelmed, his sinews cut from his body and hidden away, leaving him powerless. The world seemed on the brink of chaos once more. But Hermes and Pan recovered Zeus's stolen strength, and with it, he returned to the fray. At last, Zeus summoned the full storm. He unleashed a torrent of thunderbolts so fierce that Typhon fled, pursued across the land, until Zeus cast him beneath Mount Etna in Sicily. There, imprisoned beneath the earth, Typhon's fiery breath caused eruptions, and his thrashings shook the ground as earthquakes. Even in defeat, he was not silent. His presence remained part of the world's fabric, a reminder that chaos is never destroyed, only contained. With Typhon subdued, Zeus's reign was secure. The Olympians had faced the primordial forces of earth and abyss and emerged victorious. The cosmos was ordered, each god with a realm, each power given its place. From this order, the world as mortals knew it could finally take shape. But victory also brought new questions. If the gods were now secure, what of humanity? Where did mortals fit in this grand design? What role would men and women play in a cosmos dominated by immortals? It is here, in the myths of creation and punishment, that we see the gods turn their gaze toward humankind. The the heroic age, between gods and men. The Greeks believed that there was once an age unlike any other, a time between the eternal rule of the gods and the fleeting lives of ordinary mortals. This was the heroic age, a liminal era where divine blood mingled with human flesh, producing men and women who were greater than mortals, but never quite gods. They embodied both the virtues the Greeks admired, courage, cleverness, endurance, and the flaws they feared, anger, arrogance, and hubris. The heroic age gave the world figures larger than life, whose stories still echo across centuries. Their lives were not just tales of adventure, but lessons about the fragile line between greatness and ruin. Perseus, the first of heroes. The first among them was Perseus, son of Zeus, and the mortal Danae. His life began with danger. Danae's father, King Acrisius of Argos, received a prophecy that his grandson would one day kill him. In fear, Acrisius locked Danae in a bronze chamber. But even walls of metal could not keep out Zeus. Disguised as a golden shower of light, the king of the gods entered her chamber, and Perseus was conceived. When the child was born, Acrisius dared not kill him directly for fear of divine wrath. Instead, he cast mother and child adrift at sea in a wooden chest. Fate, however, would not let them perish. They washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where Perseus grew into a strong young man. His true adventure began when he was tasked with the impossible, to slay Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned men into stone. Few dared even to look at her, but Perseus was not without help. The gods armed him for his quest. Athena gave him a polished bronze shield to use as a mirror. Hermes lent him his winged sandals to fly, and from Hades, he received the Helm of Darkness, a cap that made its wearer invisible. With these gifts, Perseus crept upon the Gorgon as she slept. He did not meet her gaze, but watched her reflection in the shield. With one swift stroke, he severed her head. From her neck sprang two beings, the giant Chrysaor and the winged horse Pegasus, who would carry other heroes in ages to come. Perseus's triumphs did not end there. On his return, he encountered Andromeda, chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster. With Medusa's head, he turned the beast to stone and rescued her. She became his wife, and together they founded dynasties that stretched across Greece. Perseus's story was one of divine aid and bravery, but also of cunning, knowing how to face terror without looking directly into it. Bellerophon, pride before the fall. If Perseus showed the triumph of courage, Bellerophon embodied the danger of pride. His tale was intertwined with that of Pegasus, the winged horse born from Medusa's blood. Bellerophon, with Athena's help, tamed Pegasus by using a golden bridle given by the goddess. Mounted on the divine steed, he became a warrior without equal. His greatest feat was the slaying of the Chimera, a fire-breathing beast with the body of a lion, the head of a goat, and the serpent's tail. Armed with a spear tipped with lead, Bellerophon soared above the monster on Pegasus, driving the weapon into its throat. The lead melted in the Chimera's fiery breath, suffocating it from within. For this, he was celebrated as a hero, but success bred arrogance. Believing himself worthy of the gods' company, Bellerophon attempted to ride Pegasus into Olympus itself. The gods were not amused. Zeus sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus, who bucked his rider. Bellerophon fell back to earth, crippled and broken, wandering alone until death. His life became a warning. Greatness must be tempered with humility, for even the most honored hero is still mortal. The heroic age, having given rise to figures like Perseus, Theseus, and Heracles, reached its zenith and also its sunset in one grand conflict, the Trojan War. To the Greeks, this war was not merely a clash of armies or a quarrel among kings. It was the cosmic stage upon which the greatest heroes of myth shone, where gods and men fought side by side, and where the fragile bond between divine and mortal finally began to unravel. It was both the culmination of centuries of legend and the twilight of an age, a moment when the glory of heroes burned its brightest, only to fade into sorrow and memory. The origins of the war, as so often in Greek myth, lay in a quarrel among the gods. when the sea goddess Thetis was given in marriage to the mortal king Peleus. All the gods attended their wedding except Eris, goddess of strife. Angered at being excluded, she hurled a golden apple into the feast, inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." At once, 3 goddesses claimed it. Hera, queen of Olympus, desired the honor. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, asserted her right. And Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, reached for it as well. Their dispute threatened to divide Olympus itself, so Zeus, unwilling to choose, appointed a mortal to decide. That mortal was Paris, prince of Troy, famed for his beauty but doomed to bring ruin upon his people. The goddesses did not present their claims with fairness alone. Each offered Paris a bribe. Hera promised him kingship and dominion. Athena promised wisdom and victory in battle. And Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman alive. Paris, swayed by desire, chose Aphrodite, and with that choice, the seeds of war were sown. For the woman promised to him was Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. When Paris carried her off to Troy, whether by seduction or abduction, it was an insult that the Greeks could not ignore. Menelaus invoked the oath, sworn by all Helen's suitors, that they would defend her marriage if ever it were broken. Bound by honor, kings and princes from across Greece gathered, forming a vast coalition of armies to bring Helen back and avenge the insult. The leaders of this coalition were men whose names would echo across the centuries. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and brother of Menelaus, commanded the host. At his side stood Achilles, son of the sea nymph Thetis, nearly invincible, and the greatest warrior Greece would ever know. There was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, famed for his cunning and his quick words as much as for his strength. There was Ajax the Great, towering and unyielding, a bulwark of the battlefield. There was Nestor, wise and aged, who remembered the deeds of earlier days. There was Diomedes, fierce in battle and bold enough even to wound gods. And there were countless others, each carrying their own story into the war. On the Trojan side stood no fewer heroes. Hector, prince of Troy, was their greatest champion, noble, courageous, and dutiful to the end. Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, bore the weight of destiny beyond Troy itself, a thread later woven into Rome's own origin. Paris, beautiful but reckless, was there as well, the man whose choice had sparked the conflict, and the gods, unwilling to stay neutral, took sides. Hera and Athena supported the Greeks, still bitter over Paris's judgment. Aphrodite stood with Troy, protecting Paris again and again from certain death. Apollo favored the Trojans, guiding arrows with divine precision, while Zeus sought balance, though he often leaned toward his mortal son Sarpedon. Thus, the war began, not only as a struggle of men, but as an extension of divine rivalries. Though the conflict spanned 10 years, Homer's Iliad focuses on only a few weeks of the war, yet within those weeks lies its essence. At the heart of the poem is not the war itself, but the wrath of Achilles. At the outset, Agamemnon's arrogance brought strife within the Greek camp. When he seized the maiden Briseis from Achilles, it was an insult too great to bear. Achilles, in his fury, withdrew from battle, refusing to fight, and without him, the Greeks faltered. The Trojans pressed hard, led by Hector, and drove the Greeks back to the very brink of destruction, their ships nearly lost to fire. In desperation, Achilles' beloved companion, Patroclus, donned his armor and entered the fray. He fought bravely, driving back the Trojans, but in his zeal he pressed too far, and Hector struck him down. When the news reached Achilles, grief overwhelmed him, and grief gave way to unrelenting fury. He returned to battle with vengeance in his heart, cutting down all who stood before him. His duel with Hector became the war's tragic climax. Hector knew his fate and knew he could not prevail, but he stood firm for honor, for Troy, and for his family. Achilles struck him down and, in rage, defiled his body, dragging it around the walls of Troy. Yet even in his wrath, Achilles was reminded of his humanity. Hector's aged father, King Priam, came to him in the night, kissed the hands that had killed his son, and begged for his body. Achilles, moved to tears, relented, and for a brief moment, enemies shared their grief as fathers, as sons, as men. Hector's death marked the turning of the tide, but the war did not end swiftly. Prophecy declared that Troy could not fall without the bow of Heracles, wielded by Philoctetes, and so the Greeks brought him to the battlefield. Destiny also decreed the fall of Achilles. Paris, guided by Apollo, loosed an arrow that struck his only vulnerable spot, his heel, and so the greatest warrior of Greece was slain. In the absence of Achilles, the Greeks turned to cunning. It was Odysseus who conceived the stratagem that would be remembered forever, the Trojan horse. Pretending to abandon the war, the Greeks left behind a colossal wooden horse, a supposed offering to the gods, while their fleet hid beyond the horizon. The Trojans, believing the ruse, dragged the horse within their walls. That night, while Troy slept in celebration, Greek warriors emerged from its belly, opened the gates, and signaled the fleet's return. Troy burned, its walls fell, its people were slaughtered or enslaved. A city that had stood for centuries was reduced to ash. From the ruin of Troy came the fading light of the heroic age. Few heroes survived to see peace, and those who did often met grim fates. Agamemnon returned home, only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, in vengeance for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia. Ajax the Great, shamed after losing the contest for Achilles' armor, fell upon his own sword. Menelaus reclaimed Helen, but their reunion was haunted by the shadows of betrayal and war. Odysseus wandered 10 long years across stormy seas and hostile lands before finding his way home. Only Aeneas, guided by Aphrodite, carried a remnant of Troy westward, destined to found a new people, a story that Rome would later make its own. The Trojan War marked a turning point in the Greek imagination. For centuries, the gods had walked openly among men, aiding, opposing, or deceiving them. But with the fall of Troy, their presence began to wane. Mortals would now shoulder their fate with less divine guidance and more struggle. The heroic age ended, not with triumph but with sorrow. Its heroes had shone brighter than ordinary men, yet their light was brief and their ends were tragic. Their immortality did not lie in their flesh, which perished, nor in their cities, which crumbled, but in the memory of their deeds, preserved in song and story. The poets sang of them, Homer gave them voice, and tragedy kept their memory alive. They became immortal in remembrance, not in life. And as their age closed, humanity stepped into a harsher, lonelier world, one where the gods were distant, and men had to forge their lives with their own hands, carrying only the memory of heroes who had once walked between gods and men. With the heroic age ended, Greek mythology entered its final phase, not as living belief in the same way as before, but as cultural memory. The gods, still imagined as enthroned on Olympus, no longer strode across the stage of mortal affairs so directly. Mortals no longer expected Zeus to hurl thunderbolts at every injustice, or Athena to appear in disguise to guide every journey. Instead, the myths themselves became the enduring presence. The stories, once believed to be history unfolding before human eyes, began to take on a different role, shaping identity, culture, and imagination. They lived on, not only in temples and rituals, but also in the arts, in philosophy, and eventually, in the very foundations of Western thought. In the classical period, the myths found renewed vitality. They were not locked away as old legends, but continually reinterpreted in art, drama, and ritual. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides retold the sufferings of Agamemnon, Oedipus, and Medea, not as fairy tales meant for children, but as urgent reflections on justice, fate, and human weakness. When the Athenians sat in the theater of Dionysus, they were not escaping into fantasy, they were holding up a mirror to themselves. The characters on stage, whether kings cursed by prophecy or women driven to desperate revenge, were embodiments of the human soul, struggling with forces larger than themselves. Through tragedy, myth was reborn as philosophy in action. The civic life of Greece was also saturated with myth. Temples rose across the land, each dedicated to a god, whose story reflected the virtues or fears of the community. The Parthenon in Athens stood as a shining tribute to Athena, the city's patron goddess, a reminder of wisdom, protection, and civic pride. At Delphi, Apollo's sanctuary became known as the navel of the world. Pilgrims came from across Greece to hear the oracle, a priestess who, in trance, spoke cryptic words, believed to be inspired by the god himself. To consult Apollo was to place one's fate into the very hands of myth, and in the festivals of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, drama itself was born. Choruses sang the stories of gods and heroes, and actors brought myth to life in performance, merging entertainment with ritual, storytelling with devotion. Mythology was not simply remembered, it was lived. But myth was not static. As Greek thought matured, it began to question itself. Philosophers turned their gaze upon the old tales and asked whether they were true, or more subtly, in what sense they were true. Xenophanes, a poet and thinker of the 6th century BCE, criticized the gods for their all-too-human flaws. How could the divine be eternal and perfect, he asked, if it lied, cheated, and quarreled? Plato later used myths, not as literal accounts of the gods, but as allegories, pointing toward deeper truths. In his dialogues, myths like the story of or the tale of Atlantis became vehicles for exploring morality, justice, and the soul's immortality. And yet, for ordinary Greeks, these philosophical refinements did not erase the old stories. Myths remained woven into prayers, sacrifices, and festivals. The philosopher might see allegory. The farmer still prayed to Demeter for a good harvest, and the sailor still honored Poseidon before setting sail. As centuries passed, the myths crossed cultural borders. When Rome rose to power, it absorbed Greek mythology into its own framework, translating gods and stories into Latin names. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Poseidon became Neptune, Athena became Minerva. The transformations were cosmetic, not substantive. The stories themselves endured, adapted to Roman needs. In Virgil's Aeneid, the fall of Troy became the seed of Rome's destiny, with Aeneas cast not only as a Trojan survivor, but as the mythical founder of a future empire. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, wove together hundreds of Greek myths into a single sweeping poem, a treasury of transformation that would become a cornerstone of Western imagination. Through Rome, Greek mythology entered the bloodstream of Europe, carried into law, art, and literature. With the coming of Christianity, the old gods lost their worshippers, but they did not lose their voices. Church fathers denounced them as false deities or demons, but their stories remained preserved in manuscripts, whispered through the verses of poets, remembered in mosaics and frescoes. The Christian world sought to replace them with saints and martyrs, yet the myths survived in the margins, lingering as cultural memory. And then, in the Renaissance, they re-emerged with new vigor. Painters depicted Apollo driving his chariot across the sky. Sculptors revived the figure of Heracles, straining against his labors. Poets reimagined Odysseus's wanderings and Orpheus's song. The myths never died. They transformed, reshaped for new audiences and new eras. And so, dear listener, our journey through the vast expanse of Greek mythology comes to a gentle close. We have walked together from the first breath of chaos, through the births of earth and sky, through the wars of titans, giants, and monsters. We have traced the making of mankind, the giving and taking of fire, the sorrows that spilled from Pandora's jar, and the fragile spark of hope that remained. We have walked in step with heroes, Perseus, Theseus, Heracles, Achilles, men who were more than mortal but never quite divine. And finally, we have stood at the walls of Troy, watching the heroic age flicker out like the last embers of a great fire. Yet, as the myths themselves remind us, endings are never endings alone. Just as one age gives way to another, so too do stories live on, even after their tellers are gone. The Greeks may no longer pour libations to Zeus or climb the steps of Delphi to consult Apollo's oracle, but the myths they left behind are alive in our words, in our art, in our very ways of thinking. We still speak of a Herculean effort, of an Achilles' heel, of a Pandora's box. We still find ourselves caught between the pride of hubris and the warning of Nemesis. We still sense the truth in the story of Prometheus, that every gift of progress comes with a cost. And we still feel the weight of mortality, just as Achilles did when he chose a short life of glory over a long life of obscurity. These stories endure because they are, in the end, not just about gods and heroes. They are about us, our fears, our hopes, our flaws, and our longings. They remind us that suffering is part of life, but so is resilience. That tragedy shadows greatness, but memory makes it shine. And above all, they remind us that hope, small though it may be, remains. So, as you drift now into reflection, or perhaps into sleep, carry with you the sense that you have walked through an entire cosmos of meaning. The Greeks gave us a universe where nothing was simple, but everything had a story. Night and day, love and war, death and rebirth. To know their myths is to see the world as they saw it, alive, mysterious, and filled with voices. The gods may be silent now, their temples fallen to ruin, but their echoes still speak. In the hush of the sea, in the flicker of firelight, in the whisper of wind through trees, you may still hear the footsteps of the old stories. And if you listen closely, you might just hear them speaking, reminding you that though ages pass and civilizations fade, the power of myth endures. Thank you for walking this long road with me tonight. May these stories keep you company in the quiet hours, and may they leave you with the same gift the Greeks always carried with them: hope, even in the face of hardship. Until next time, rest well, dream deeply, and remember, the myths live on, wherever there are those willing to tell them.